Hey, what's up, nerds? Welcome back to Guys of Magic. This is Shane, and today I'm joined by David. Say what up, dude.
Yo, what's going on, everybody?
We're going to be doing a continuation upgrade for the Desert Bloom deck. David did the $100 upgrade for Yuma. We're going to be adding on to that. We're going to be giving him a bigger budget, and he's going to be making it even more beefy. Just like the original $100, we're doing another $300 as well with the backup commander that'll be over on our Patreon. But if you would like to see the backup commander being upgraded with $300 budget, the link in the description will take you to our Patreon where you can find it. So before we jump into all of your new additions, do you want to just talk about the commander again and remind everyone what the game plan is?
Yeah, so the commander is Yuma, Proud Protector. We're going to be sticking with the face commander here. He is 5, a red, a green, and a white, so he does cost 8 mana, which is a lot, but he's a 6/6, and he says he costs 1 less to cast for each land in your graveyard. He also says whenever he enters or whenever he attacks, you may sacrifice a land, and if you do, you draw a card. And then lastly, he does say whenever a desert card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you create a 4/2 plant warrior creature token with reach. I'm not going to lie, I was actually relatively low on Yuma before we started goofing around with him. However, the more opportunity that I've had to play with this commander, I've realized that, number one, he actually does come out a lot cheaper and a lot quicker than what you might imagine, especially from an 8-drop commander. And two, those 4/2 elementals are surprisingly important, at least playing up against these other precons. So they're very relevant, and I've had quite a bit of fun so far playing around with Yuma.
Yuma looks fun, man. I liked the $100 upgrade. I liked the shenanigans you could pull with all the little cacti. Before we jump into your new additions, though, David, on the screen right now, since this is a continuation upgrade, you'll see all the cards that you're bringing from your 100. I'm guessing you liked them over there. You're bringing them over here.
So I added almost all of them for the 300. There is one card that I did end up removing in between the 100 and 300, but we'll talk about that when we get to cuts.
Perfect. Well, speaking of new additions, man, don't keep me waiting. Let's talk about some new additions.
Yeah, so to kick this off, we're going to talk a little bit about the creatures. This deck actually does a fairly decent job of just being able to make creatures. There's a couple token enablers, so I don't really have a ton of creatures that I wanted to put into this. Instead, I really wanted to play around more with like important landfall triggers. So this first creature is Geode Rager. It is 4 and 2 red for a creature elemental. It's a 4/3 with first strike, and it has landfall. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you go to each creature target player controls. So this is really important because you can force a player to have their entire team go into forced combat. That means that you can potentially leave them open for any kind of like retaliation. They're going to be open where they're not going to be able to block themselves. Or you can just kind of like cause mass chaos where if you have multiple lands enter, you can do a really good job of just being able to protect yourself by making all of your opponents attack each other.
That's terrifying, man. Goat commanders in general are terrifying, so just this card goading all of my stuff, don't like that.
The next one here is Morag, Fury of Aquam, and I am probably butchering that name, so I apologize. But this is 4 and 2 red for a total of 6 mana. You get a legendary creature, Minotaur Warrior. It is a 6/6 and says each creature you control gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn. It also has a landfall ability that states whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if it is your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. This works really well with our deck. Not only is it just like a potential finisher where we can start swinging in multiple times for multiple combats, but this also synergizes really well with Yuma because he has an attack trigger. So we'll be able to potentially make more of our plant warriors while also drawing more cards.
Yikes. Yeah, I see the synergies here, dude. Pretty scary. Those look like the 2 creatures you'd be adding. What about some other kind of permanents?
Yeah, so we are going to be throwing in a single artifact into this list. I felt that this artifact was very important, and I really wanted this one actually inside the 100 as well, but we just didn't have the budget for it there. And this is Amulet of Vigor. For 1 mana, you get an artifact that says whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped and under your control, untap it. So one of the common themes with deserts is that they almost all enter the battlefield tapped, which isn't very cool because that means you're kind of like stifling your mana for the turn. Amulet of Vigor fixes that. So all of our deserts that would normally enter tapped will enter and then they will untap. So you have access to that mana or that ability on that desert immediately. So very important card for a deck like this.
Yeah, I would say so. Like your land base is slow in general, so this just makes it way better. Love this include.
And then the next card we're going to talk about, we're going to start to dive into our enchantments, but the next card we're going to talk about does something very similar, and that is Spelunking. It is 2 and a green for an enchantment. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and then you put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put a cave onto the battlefield this way, you gain 4 life. We don't have any caves in this deck, so you're not going to be able to get that ability, but we're mainly using this for the second ability here, and that is that lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So same kind of thing that we're going to be talking about with the Amulet of Vigor. Now, sadly, this one does cost 3 mana, so I don't really like this one as much. This isn't what you're going to be dropping on turn 1 and then being able to actually like make your consistent land drops from there and not have to worry about your tapped lands, but it is still really nice to be able to have this backup in the deck, and this one does have that added benefit that it'll draw you a card.
Yeah, I love this card. This is a newer one. I'm seeing it in standard a lot, but it goes great in your deck too.
The next enchantment that we're going to add is Undergrowth Recon. This is 1 and 2 green. For a total of 3 mana, you get an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Like that consistent recursion, we're going to be dumping a lot of cards into our graveyard. We're going to be dumping a lot of lands into the graveyard. So this, in a way, kind of helps us to ramp because that's not counting as our land for the turn. And it's just going to continue to make sure that we're just fueling what we have in play. And that, of course, means that we have more sacrifice fodder for our commander.
Yeah, this card goes crazy with Yuma.
We have 2 more enchantments to wrap up this package. These are just generally going to be some good stuff enchantment cards. The first one here is Trouble in Pairs. This is 2 and 2 white for a total of 4 mana. It is an enchantment that says if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. It also says whenever an opponent attacks you with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. If you have not picked up your copy of this already, I very, very much so urge you to do so. This card is absolutely insane. It may very well be the best white draw engine in the game.
It just says, are your opponents playing Commander? If so, draw a card.
Yeah, and especially in a deck like this too. So like if you do happen to go over max hand size, that means, oh no, you just get to discard some of those deserts and make plant warriors.
Yeah, good card is good.
Smothering Tithe is the next one. This is 3 and a white for a total of 4 mana. It's an enchantment that says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. And if that player doesn't, you create a treasure token. Same thing that I kind of had to mention about the last one. This is just a very powerful engine, but this one's not going to draw you cards. This one's going to make you treasures, which means you can afford to do just about whatever you want.
Yeah, blow up your land. Oh, well, you got treasure. Speaking of land, it looks like we're adding a bunch of new lands. Talk to me about them.
We are. So I didn't really play around a whole lot with the mana base for the $100 just because I felt like a lot of the lands that I did want to throw into the $300 were a little bit more on the pricey side, but they do work really well with Yuma. So the first 3 lands that we're going to be including are all 3 of the fetch lands of this color combination. So we're going to have Arid Mesa, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. The way that these lands work is that you can tap them, pay 1 life, sacrifice them, and then search your library for one of 2 different basic land types. You can go find cards that are not necessarily basic lands, so as long as they have the basic land on them. But the reason why these cards are so good is because they're going to go to the graveyard. They're wonderful in the opening turns. It's going to help to make Yuma even cheaper. It works really, really well whenever it comes to landfall abilities. And then in the later portions of the game, if you do happen to have something like a Crucible of Worlds in play, you're guaranteed to hit your land drops. And then you can also start fetching from there. So this is going to be like double landfall triggers every time you're going to be able to pop one of these.
Yeah. Fetches are great in land decks.
We are throwing in a single shock land that's going to be Stomping Grounds. It is a land that is both a mountain and a forest, so it can tap for either a red or a green. Whenever it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped unless you pay 2 life. So just kind of use it whenever you need to. I love that flexibility, and I love the fact that we can fetch this. Up next, we have Field of the Dead. This says it enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for a colorless. It also says whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you're going to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. We love tokens. We love landfall. So the fact that this kind of synergizes in both of those regards means we should be able to make quite a few 2/2 zombies. We also have Lotus Field in this list. This is a land that has hexproof. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, it does so tapped, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice 2 lands. Now, normally that's a downside, but in a deck like this, you can sacrifice 2 deserts to make 2 plant warriors, and Lotus Field on its own can tap to add 3 mana of any one color. So it doesn't necessarily ramp you. It kind of consolidates your mana a little bit, but this is a great card just to be able to get into play. It's difficult for your opponents to interact with since it does have hexproof, and being able to throw more lands into your graveyard means Yuma gets cheaper, and you maybe make some tokens.
That's really good in your deck, man. Jeez.
We have two of the bond lands included here as well. The first of which is Bonneful Promenade. This is a land. It says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you have two or more opponents, and it taps for a green or a white. And Spire Garden has that same stipulation, but taps for either a red or a green. These are fantastic. These are some of the best lands you can have in Commander. The only downside is you can't fetch them.
Yeah, that's all right. They're great lands.
And then the last land that we're going to be including, in fact, actually the last card we're going to be including on the $300 is Arid Archway. This is one of the brand new deserts that we just got out of Thunder Junction. It says it enters the battlefield tapped. Whenever it does, however, you're going to return a land you control back to its owner's hand, and if another desert was returned this way, you're going to surveil one. Arid Archway taps for 2 colorless. So it doesn't necessarily like net negative you. It will bounce one of your things for that turn, but that's not a bad thing. We do care about landfall, and surveilling in a Desert Matters deck where it cares about your deserts going to the graveyard from anywhere is really neat. We could potentially make a token off this.
Love it. It's a desert. That taps for 2 for you, Dave. Love it. And is that going to be all your new additions for the 300?
That is going to be it for the 300, for all of our new additions at least.
Right on. Well, just like any other upgrade we do, we got to get to the part now where we make room for all those new additions. So before we jump into your new cuts on screen, we're going to flash all of the cards that you were cutting from the 100. Since you're bringing that addition over, you got to also bring those cuts over. So all these cards on the screen were cut. If you want to see why David cut these, you can find a link to the video and watch it. You can check it out. But enough for the old cuts. David, talk to me a little bit about these new cuts.
So the first card that I'm going to be talking about here is actually one of the cards that I did include for the 100, and that is going to be Araness Gloomstalker. She is 2 and a green for a total of 3 mana. You get a legendary creature, Halfling Ranger. She's a 3/3 with Death Touch and says whenever she attacks, you return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. She's a cool little recursion engine. I did happen to find, however, in higher power, she does die a little bit too soon, and with her needing to be able to swing in and attack, it is not necessarily the most stable engine. I just felt like there were better options out there, and now that we have more money to play around with, we can kind of replace her with some better stuff. The next card is Nesting Dragon. This is 3 and 2 red for a total of 5 mana. It's a creature dragon. It's a 5/4 with flying, and it has landfall. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/2 red dragon egg creature token with Defender, and whenever this creature dies, create a 2/2 red dragon creature token with flying, and pay a red, this creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. I do like this card. I think this is pretty neat. However, we're actually not really in need of like little flyers in this deck, or even just generally like mid-sized flyers in this deck, because our tokens have reach, which is very impactful. The other thing here being too is, although we do have like all of this token production potentially on Nesting Dragon, I don't really want 0/2 dragon eggs. I would rather be making bigger things or doing other abilities with landfall triggers. And that's kind of what we are going to be replacing Nesting Dragon with. Up next, sadly, we're going to be cutting the backup commander to this deck. This is Kiri, Talented Sprout. It is 1 a red, a green, and a white for a total of 4 mana. It is a 0/3 legendary creature plant druid. It says other plants and tree folk you control get +2/+0. And it also says at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, return target plant, tree folk, or land card from your graveyard to your hand. We don't really have any plants or tree folk in this deck that are going to make this super worth it. And although it is really nice to be able to get that land card back, we have other ways for us to be able to play lands from our graveyard, or be able to grab those lands and put them back into play. Kiri is a little bit awkward here, just because we don't have enough really plants and tree folk to make that power boost work. I know she synergizes with the tokens that we're going to be making off of Yuma, but they're big enough on their own. They don't really need that +2. Angel of Indemnity is the last creature we're going to be removing here. This is 5 and a white for a total of 6 mana. It's a creature Angel Warrior. It is a 5/5 with both flying and lifelink. Well, it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you return target permanent card with mana value of 4 or less from your graveyard back to the battlefield. And this does have an encore ability for 6 and 2 white. I actually did really like this card whenever I was playing around with the $100 version. I felt like for the most part, it did everything that I wanted it to. However, I found for the most part, just good old Sun Titan kind of does the exact same thing, and in many ways actually does it a little bit better, because that card is a repeatable effect, and it's already included in this list. Angel of Indemnity, I often found myself grabbing lands, of which at that point, this is kind of expensive for that format of an ability. Up next, we have Genesis Hydra. This is X and 2 green for a creature plant Hydra. It is a 0/0 and says whenever you cast a spell, you reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with mana value of X or less from among them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle the rest into your library. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. I'm not going to lie, whenever I was building the 300, one of the primary goals was for me to drop the mana value of this deck by as much as I possibly could, just to make sure that we can streamline this. I would rather cast 2 spells per turn rather than just cast a single big thing per turn. So Genesis Hydra, this is a card that I feel like it's a little bit of a trap. It is a cool card, but I feel like for the most part, you want it to stay in your hand until you have a ton of mana. And I have actually found through playtesting with this deck, once Yuma hits play and starts blowing up your lands, you kind of stifle yourself. For the most part, I feel like this deck starts to really just kind of like putter out once it has like, I would say about 6 to 8 lands in play, and you really don't actually produce more mana than that. So Genesis Hydra, a little bit of a weird inclusion here. I see why it was put into the Precon to begin with, but just playing around with this deck, I feel like it doesn't really mesh with the theme.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. So you wanted to stick to the theme, and you're cutting out some creatures that don't really make sense. Those are all the creatures to be cutting. How about something else? Maybe some sorceries.
So we do have a single source we're going to be removing here, and that is Escape to the Wilds. Escape to the Wilds is 3, a red, and a green for a sorcery that says exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may play cards exiled this way until the end of your next turn, and you may play an additional land this turn. I just felt for the most part, this card was a little bit more on the expensive side for what it was doing, and same thing that I mentioned earlier, I was really trying to drop the overall mana value of this deck.
I can understand that, man. Next, I'm seeing that looks like you're cutting 1 enchantment. Talk to me about it.
I am going to be cutting an enchantment. I'm a little torn on this enchantment, to be honest with you. I like part of this card, and that is going to be the Mending of Dominaria. This is 3 and 2 green. For a total of 5 mana, you get a enchantment Saga. On the first 2 lore counters, it says mill 2 cards and then return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it does kind of like act as like a little bit of a pseudo card advantage. It'll give you those creatures back. And then the third mode on this, the third lore counter says return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. I actually don't like the third mode on this card, and the reason being is even though we are getting all those lands back, oftentimes with this, I feel like we're setting ourselves up for a little bit of a blowout. If Yuma does end up dying, if there's like a big board wipe that follows suit with this, we just got rid of all of our cards that we had in our graveyard, which our deck does care about. I love the mill aspect of this, but I don't like that big payoff at the end. And I also don't really care for the fact that this is 5 mana for a card that really wants to be in play to help set up our deck, not something that we want to be able to like drop in the mid to later portions of the game.
Yeah, like you said, that would suck so bad if something were to happen to Yuma, and then you have all your lands on your field, and now it costs $1 billion again. So I can understand this cut too. And it looks like that's going to be all of the non-land permanents. Let's talk about some lands. You added a bunch. What are you cutting?
I am cutting a bunch of lands as well. So one of the big themes with this deck, obviously, we're trying to play as many deserts as we possibly can to make sure that we're maximizing our ability to make those plant warriors. Now, I also happen to be playing around with a couple of other things in this deck. One of the big things being, for example, the card Hermit Druid, which we talked about in the $100 video. It works really, really, really well if there are very few basic lands. And I figured, well, let's go ahead and improve the mana base, but I don't want to remove any of the deserts. So we're actually only going to be removing non-desert cards. And there's not a ton that I wanted to get rid of for this list, so we're a little selective here. The first card is Scattered Groves. This is a land. It is both a forest and a plant. It could tap for a green or a white. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it does have a cycling ability in which you can pay 2 to discard it and draw a card. I like the cycling. I like how you can just like throw this into the graveyard, but this is not a desert. So this really is only going to be in the deck to help make Yuma cheaper. It doesn't make a plant token on its own, and I don't really want to fetch for this card. So Scattered Groves gets the cut. The next card here is Terramorphic Expanse. This is a land that you can tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. I'm actually not super opposed to Terramorphic Expanse in this deck. And don't get me wrong, we still have Evolving Wilds in the list. They basically function the exact same. I just needed to remove one more land, and I figured, you know what? We just threw in all those fetch lands. They kind of function very similarly, so Terramorphic Expanse happens to get the cut. And then lastly, we are going to be removing a couple of the basic lands here. So I'm going to be trimming us down by 2 basic forests, 2 basic mountains, and 3 basic plains. So we're cutting a lot of the basic lands in this deck, and the primary reason for us doing so is just to make sure we have as many deserts or as desert heavy as we possibly can be, while still making sure we're upgrading this mana base, making sure it's running a little bit more smoothly, and then also making it work a little bit better with some of our other payoff cards that are going to be dumping cards into our graveyard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, man. You very much so bolstered the lands in your additions. So These cuts make sense. Is that going to do it though? Is that going to be all the cuts and additions for this 300?
That is going to do it. That's going to be all the cuts and additions for this video. I know I'm going to have some comments. Go ahead and drop them down below. I will try my absolute best to answer as many of them as I possibly can. I know that there were a couple people who had some ideas for the $100 as far as like inclusions. I did try to play around with some of those as much as I could for the 300, but there are some cards that I just wasn't really like the biggest fan of that just didn't end up making this list for me.
Yeah, I can understand that too, man. Is there any other final thoughts you'd like to talk about for Yuma and the deck as a whole? I guess you kind of just did, but any other final thoughts?
I think my final thought is this deck kind of seems to be a little polarizing. I've seen a lot of negative commentary on this deck specifically from this cycle. A lot of people are looking at this and just like, this is one is not very well equipped. It's not really doing its thing. It's not a good deck. And what I will say is I actually really disagree. I don't like Naya. It's one of my least favorite color combinations. And in fact, actually, it is the combination of my two least favorite color combinations, both Boros and Selesnya. However, Yuma actually is relatively surprising at what you can get away with. He is a massive generator in terms of just like value in the mid to late portions of the game. He does come out much earlier than what you typically expect from him. And the fact that he's a 6/6 body is nothing to scoff at either. He builds up a really big board presence very quickly. So if you are curious around playing around with deserts, I do think that Yuma is quite a bit of fun, or just landfall decks in general. This is a cool new take, and I'm actually here for this.
I'm here for it too, man. I liked all the rounds of these precons, man. But Yuma, yeah, it looks fun. We did give you a budget of $300 for this upgrade. What is it going to come out to if you pick up all these ads?
It is right at that $300 list. So just keep in mind, prices do fluctuate. Some of these cards may go up or down. It just kind of happens anytime that there's a new pre-release cycle that gets dropped.
Yep. I get that, bud. Right on. Well, like David originally said too, if you would like to leave him a comment, maybe he's got a cut that he missed or a card that he missed for adding, leave a comment down below letting him know. We all love reading them and we love growing and we love building better decks next time for you guys. So leave him a comment. Also, while you're down there, make sure you like this video if you enjoyed the upgrade. In the description below, you'll find a link to this Mox field where you can goldfish it, test the deck out a little bit, and then pick up all the ads if you wanted to do so. Also, down in the description, you'll find a link to all of our social media. That is TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, at Guys at Magic for all of them. And then lastly, we have our Patreon link down below. Like we've been saying, we're doing something a little different for these decks. We're also uploading $100 and $300 upgrades to the backup commanders on our Patreon. So if you wanted to see the Kiri upgrade for $300, check out the link in the description. And until the next video, this has been Guys of Magic. Bye-bye.
Later.